Hello, no snazzy makeup today. I'm not feeling great, my background isn't up, and I have a dog in my onesie. Do you want to say hi, Jellybean? Say hi. Yeah, there's a good girl. Yeah, she likes it in there. So we're hanging out together, and I wanted to get this to you. So let's begin. Roses are red, violets are blue. This is a poem. But is that true? Well, there seems to be some disagreement in the poetic community about what actually constitutes a poem. And today that is what we are going to deep dive into so that we can see if we can maybe come up with a satisfactory answer. Savvy? Let's get to it, Pruitt. Hello, friend faces, and welcome back to How to Poe, the beginning. This time we are talking about what a poem actually is. Now, I'm Abby Dorable and I love poetry, but when it comes to poems and poets and poetry, I really want to clear the air because as much as I love it, it really needs a bit of renovation. And if you love poetry too, if you're vaguely interested in what I have to say, or if you like Jellybean, say hi again, Jellybean. There you go, good girl. Please consider subscribing and hitting that like button because it keeps the YouTube engines happy. So in the last video, I tackled what poetry is, and we found out that it's actually not just a group of poems, and it's not just the study of poems. It is an altered state of consciousness where we feel open and a sense of wonder, almost like we're dreaming. And there can be synesthetic manifestations of it, like Emily Dickinson's coldness, Walt Whitman's beardy tinkles in my expanding head. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you might want to go back and watch that, but after we're done here, I'll link it in the description box. I will link it in the description box below. Words are important. But because poetry is also a collective noun for a group of poems and the study, it gets a little bit confusing. For the record, I will try to use poems as a collective noun for group of poems rather than poetry, but if I slip up, just know that poetry, the state of mind, is with a capital P. Poetry as the study of it, or as, a collective noun, that's with a lowercase p, and it might even appear on the screen like this. Thanks, future me. Now, if you recall from the last video, I found some definitions for poetry that related more closely to poems than it did to the actual feeling, and that included writing that formulates a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience and language, chosen and arranged, to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. That's from Merriam-Webster. There's also an arrangement of lines whose length is determined by some principle other than the width of the page. That's from Billy Collins' Masterclass. Written emotions or feelings, that's just general consensus. Brief and compressed writing, that's from all of my professors. And from my personal experience, writing poems constitutes playing with language. Now, in the last video, we went over why some of these definitions failed, but I really want to recap that here because there are some points that we kind of need to build on and why they fail. So poems aren't always page bound. Look at deaf poetry, capital D, lowercase p. Some poems do span the width of the page, like prose poems like Bath by Amy Lowell, that comes to mind. Also, Walt Whitman, he didn't necessarily ascribe to different line lengths that weren't the width of the page. When it comes to emotion, traditional haiku, like the work of Basho, doesn't include emotion. And then there are some poets like T.S. Eliot and other modernists that said that poetry is not the turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It's not the turning loose of personality, it's the escape from personality. So emotion isn't a good barometer of what we can use to include as poems. Also, there are a lot of long poems. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, Beowulf, Dante's Inferno, the Iliad, the Odyssey, all sorts of dramatic, epic poems that are really quite long. So the idea that they have to be short doesn't really work either. And as for the idea of play, well, all writing can be kind of considered that way. So it doesn't really satisfy our definition of poems where we can include everything that would be considered a poem but exclude prose. So where do we go now? Well, I vote we go back to the dictionary. This time, let's hop on over to dictionary.com and see what they say for poem. 1. A composition in verse, especially one that is characterized by a highly developed artistic form and by use of heightened language and rhythm to express an intensely imaginative interpretation of the subject. 2. Composition that, though not in verse, is characterized by great beauty of language or expression. That's not bad, but that wouldn't necessarily include all of Ogden Nash's work, which is neither beautiful nor heightened language. In fact, I can think of a great many poems where beauty and heightened language aren't necessarily the purpose of it, like Shakespeare's satirical sonnets. So, and those are definitely poems. And just as a general rule, I have an issue with the concept of heightened language. That would imply that there is lower language, and that's classifying language, which has been a huge issue in the poetic community in terms of accessibility and in terms of seeing different types of people writing poems and seeing their work represented. So classism is not okay. We don't do that on this channel. So I'll get into a little later why heightened language doesn't even work anyway. But, you know, for now, let's do what we did last time and let's go to the poets and what they have to say what a poem is. Okay, well, that escalated quickly. Future me, would you mind clearing the screen? Thank you. As we can see, basically every poet has an idea of what a poem is, and that's pretty natural. But a lot of those ideas clash because they're more impassioned manifesto than definition that we can, you know, put on a flashcard. So I've taken the liberty of paring down a lot of the definitions for the sake of time. Your time, not mine, because this took me a while. From what I have read, which is a lot, these definitions tend to fall into at least one of 4 ideological categories: poem as form, poem as sound, poem as expression, and poem as language. So let's take a look at these one by one, shall we? Form. Okay, so first I want to address kind of the elephant in the room of, you know, there are rules and there are always exceptions to rules, so why can't we just, you know, make rules and then make exceptions for them? That's a really good question. For the case of form, let's define form. You know, don't worry, this won't take long. Form, generally speaking, is the physical structure of the poem. It's shape, okay? It may be a prescribed form like a sonnet or a sestina or a haiku, or it may be the form that a poet has decided upon called free verse. But most poems have some sort of tangible physical form. Most, but not all. So it's not inclusive enough as a sole source of our definition. That's where we come into the issues, is that a lot of people are relying on this as a sole source of our definition. So form is absolutely vital in poetry. In fact, Brad Lighthouser says that it's what announces basically that it is a poem and it makes us pay attention. But form comes from all of the formal elements of a poem. And I'm not talking about top hats and ball gowns. I'm talking about things like the decisions that we make with line length, with punctuation, with rhythm, with meter, with rhyme, with other poetic tools, sound tools. You know, we make these decisions, and that in the end creates this form, whether it's a prescribed form or it is a free verse. So while form is absolutely vital to poetry, it isn't the only thing that is vital. So let's go ahead and move on to sound. Out of the gate, we can discount this as a sole source of our definition because it excludes deaf poetry, which is a huge and vital community in poetry. Now, I will say, though, that sound does have a very big bearing on most written poems. In Poetry: An Introduction by John Strachan and Richard Terry, they emphasize how poems rely on rhythmic patterning and state that the placing of words is driven by their sound as well as by their sense or meaning, and that tracks. Poems have a long oral tradition, and whether you rhyme in your poems or not, you use tools of sound, rhythms, mouthfeels, and all of that goes into the composition. In Triggering Town, a book by Richard Hugo, he says that poetry is truth set to music, music being patterned, rhythmic sounds. But again, this definition excludes deaf poetry, but it also excludes poems whose shapes contribute to the overall experience of the poem, like Il Pleut or Silencio. Those poems live a greater life on page than they do in spoken voice. We absolutely cannot discount poems like that in our definition. Now, we've already touched on emotional expression a lot, and why it's prudent not to have a definition solely revolving around that. But some poets delve deeper into the notion of expression rather than just emotion. Repeatedly, I came across two ideas in terms of what poems tend to do for expression. They take what is internal and make it external via words. So internal experience to external presence and experience. The other one is that they express fundamental truths of what it is to be a being with consciousness. Now, oftentimes they do this by juxtaposing the internal versus the external. And these are important points because nearly all poems today written are lyric poems, which focuses on the internal experience of a person. There aren't a whole lot of dramatic or epic poems being written today, and most poems do involve the internal to external. But we can't discount the dramatic and epic poems. And there are poems which don't really focus on truth or deep dive into a person's psyche. Take Roses Are Red, for example. It's not a good poem at all, i.e. it doesn't evoke poetry, but it is still a poem. And I think it's important that we include enough in our definition to encompass bad poems as well. And Ted Kooser, the US Poet Laureate from 2004 to 2006, states that by writing poems, even those poems that fail and fail miserably, we honor and affirm life. We say we loved the earth but could not stay. So we have to include bad poems. After all, when I was 6, I wrote my Halloween poem, which isn't necessarily a good poem. It's not good enough to be published. It's still a poem, though. And for every person who's starting out writing poems, who am I or who is anyone to tell you that what you're writing are not poems simply because they aren't publishable? You know, we all have to start somewhere. So including bad poems is really essential. You know, a poem may need to be resuscitated and go through many different procedures before it can live a life on its own, but a poem is still a poem. Finally, let's take a look at the idea of poems as language. When reading, this concept also naturally fell into two ideas. Poems that used heightened, special, enhanced, or more beautiful language, or poems that use language we already know in creative ways to make new connections, show uncertainty in language, and embrace ambiguity. To the first definition, I call a big BS. You know, I mentioned already the classist issues with that, but there was a study done in the 1970s that looked at all prose and poetry written in the Western world from Renaissance to the 1970s. What they found was that the way language was used in poems and prose mirrored each other. Those uses changed via era, but those changes mirrored each other. It's not necessarily that poems are using heightened or more beautiful language. So why do we have this notion that poems are this heightened language? Well, because we turn to poetry during the greatest events of our lifetimes. When there's a death, when there's a birth, when there's a marriage, when there's an inauguration. When big things happen, we turn to poems to express and to process what's going on in the world and our place in it. How you doing, Jelly Bean? She's fine. That doesn't necessarily mean that the language is more heightened than prose, though, because a lot of the words are going to be similar. So what poems do is what Ted Kooser calls a refreshing of the world, or more elaborately said, a poem is a device through which the ordinary world is seen in a new way, engaging, compelling, and even beautiful. And that's an interesting take, which really touches on the power of poems to evoke poetry. But not all poems evoke poetry, which is one of the reasons why I disagree with the definition that Matthew Zapruder set forth in his book, Why Poetry, which is one of my favorite books. And he adopted it from Paul Valery, who said that a poem is really a kind of machine for producing the poetic state of mind by means of words. Now, aside from disliking the idea of a poem as a machine, an analogy that I admit is rather apt for good poems, this definition overlooks the bad, the unedited, the ill-crafted poems of us all. And as I mentioned, we can't really do that. But Zapruder does make a point of saying that poems use language as material, a point that I found echoed from Billy Collins, Ted Kooser, and in the Norton Anthology of Poetic Forms. And I found this echoed many places. Poems treat language as an object to use. But what exactly does that mean? How do you use language as material? Well, it may be easier if we look at what poems are not. Poems are not prose. That seems simple and pretty obvious, but is it? Well-written prose can sound a lot like poetry, but we know it's prose and not poetry. How? It's not simply a matter of form or expression, sound, even really of language. It's a matter of intent and proximity. When we go to read prose, we are looking to make meaning. We are looking for information or data, whether that be instructions or a fictional story in a land far away. We are looking to make meaning out of the information that we read and draw some sort of conclusion or conclusions. Ludwig Wittgenstein tells us a poem, although it is composed in the language of information, is, and let me get this right, not used in the language game of giving information. So basically what he's saying is that though poems are made up of bits of language, usually words, poems aren't trying to communicate some sort of message. If that's the case, you might be wondering, well, what are they trying to communicate and why do they exist at all? Well, to the second, I say, why do drawings exist that don't show us how to do things? It's art. Much like drawings are made of pencil and charcoal, draw the world around us or expose us to new views, poems are made of bits of language. That's how language is made material. The intent of the poem is not communicating information, and Gregory Orr tells us that poems resist logical progressions and insist on clusters of relationships. So most language is used to communicate information like events, details, instructions, story, all of which are logical and fairly linear. Poems are not logical or exactly linear, even though you might read them line by line. The preceding line or stanza may not exactly directly relate to the subsequent line or stanza through theme or even syntax. Instead, groups of ideas, words, and sounds are bound together through use of poetic tools like rhythm, metaphor, enjambment, etc. A poem breaks apart the logic and meaning-making of language and says, stop. Feel these words and what they do. Hold them to the light. Turn them upside down, water ski on them, notice how they fit together into an object of language that lets you see the world in new and different ways and be changed by it. Part of that newness is seeing things through the poet's eyes, which brings me to my next point, proximity. Now, in a poem, you are mentally closer to a writer than in any other form of writing. You catch glimpses of the writer through voice in fiction and creative nonfiction, but in a poem, the entire thing is the voice of someone that when you read it requires you adopt that voice for just a little while. So it's like for a few moments of reading a poem, you dwell in someone else's head and see how the world looks through their eyes. That sort of proximity is heady and intense and weird, but also pretty lovely. But it also goes into the making of poetry, capital P. What's funny is that proximity and intent are inversely proportional. I'll show you what I mean. Look at these two spectra. Thank you, future me. One is the intent spectrum, where the far left is zero information and the far right is pure information. So poems lie here, and let's say terms and conditions documents lie here. The second is the proximity spectrum. Far left is zero. Anyone could have written it. There is no discernible personality in the text whatsoever. Terms and conditions documents. Far right is all the personality. We know Sammy Housat wrote this poem because it's so distinctly their voice, it can't be anyone else's. So the more information is in a piece, the farther away the writer feels. Consider a news article. Any two journalists could write on the same event and they would come across sounding vaguely similar because there would be a lot of crossover because they're reporting on the same happenings. But a poem? Give the same prompt to 15 different people and you will end up with 15 wildly different poems, because the end result isn't a communication of ideas, but rather a communion of thoughts and experiences that make up a being. And when we get a sneak peek at what it's like to be that being for a little while, we get poetry. So what does this mean for our definition? Well, what about form, sound, expression, language? Those are all important and we can't leave them out. So I propose this as a definition for a poem. A poem is an object of language that is patterned and ordered for the purposes of expression, experimentation, communion, and or play, to produce an effect to be experienced rather than communicate information to be processed. This leaves room for all types of poems, good and bad. It acknowledges the importance of form and sound while not relying solely on them. It pays attention to the effects of the poems, and it takes into account intent and proximity. It's not a perfect definition, but it is inclusive, and it's important that the definition be inclusive because poems are important to culture, society, and even to spirit. After all, poems exist when words fail us. And at those times, the only thing that we can do is turn to words to try to express what is inherently unexpressible. In doing that, we find the places where words lack, where they are ambiguous, where they are grand, and where they mean more than the sums of their parts. And when we do, we find poetry. Now, that sounds big and a little bit pretentious, but it doesn't have to be. After all, even Ogden Nash is still considered a poet. He wrote the following, which appeared in his book, Freewheeling, published by Simon & Schuster in, 1931, The Cow. The cow is of a bovine ilk, one end moo, the other milk. That is a poem, written by a poet, and published. Now, speaking of poets, what is a poet and what does it take to be one? That's the next topic in the series, so stick around for that. Part 3, what is a poet? For now, I hope that Ogden Nash poem made you chuckle or smile. I'd settle for a groan, really. But let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. And also, let me know what you think of the definition that I came up with for poem. I'd love to see if you come up with something different, maybe better. I'd be happy to adopt it if you do. To your comments, I will do my best to read and reply. A special thank you to my roomie and her kids for dealing with me while I'm doing this, because this is all really crazy. Also, thank you to Simon & Schuster for letting me read the Ogden Nash poem, and a special shout out to you guys. Thank you guys for being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that I can bring you more poetic content. And if you want to support poetic content in a more direct way, feel free to hop on over to my Patreon, where you can become an official friend face for $1 a month. It goes to buying props and keeping the fairy lights on, which they're not even on today because I'm feeling really gross, but I'll get better. So that's it for now. Love and Poe.